We continue in the Gospel according to St. Luke today, 15th chapter, beginning in verse 11. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This parable is a part of a larger piece of literature we have been looking at in this 15th chapter of Luke. 3 weeks ago, if you were here, we talked about the first 2 stories, and how this is a third. This is a series of 3 stories Jesus tells about things being lost. Remember, if you were here, we talked about first the lost sheep and how the shepherd would go out, leave the 99 and go to find the one. And we talked about the lost coin, the woman who had 10, but one was lost, and how diligently and how relentlessly she looked. And I said on that Sunday that this is illustrating for us that God's love for us is so relentless that this is a seeking God that is trying to bring us home, is trying to reach us, and will continue to love us until we are found. So this is part of that same set of stories. So the setup for this that Luke gives us is actually in the first 2 verses of this 15th chapter. Luke sets it up like this. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." Now as I begin to look at this again for our sermon this week, the first thing I noticed was how Luke says now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him or to listen to Jesus. All of them. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration. Probably not all of them. But it must have felt like all of them. You know how if you're in a group and everyone's comfortable and all of a sudden there's a lot of new people coming in, sometimes our level of anxiety goes up. Sometimes it disrupts what we're used to and how we're comfortable functioning. And in this story, it's not only that Jesus is gathering a rather large group, but they're tax collectors and sinners, Luke tells us. Now, our biblical scholars remind us the tax collectors were not a loved bunch of folks. Now, we make negative comments about IRS agents even today, but these folks had been recruited by the foreign oppressive army. The Jews are under the rule right now of the Romans. And the Romans have recruited some of the Jewish people to collect taxes on their own people. And our scholars tell us that they not only, therefore, were cooperating with what seemed like the enemy, so they were traitors, but some of them used their power that the Romans gave them to fleece their own people, perhaps their own neighbors, for their own personal financial gain. So tax collectors were not a group any respectable person would want to be around. And then there are the sinners, and our biblical scholars tell us the sinners are the group of people that have sinned so boldly or so outrageously that they have been barred from even participating in the synagogue. They have been set outside. So Jesus has drawn a most unsavory crowd. No respectable, God-loving person would want to be around these people, and yet Luke says they're all coming, and Jesus is welcoming them and eating with them. And so it really is a legitimate question on their part to Jesus to say, why do you welcome this group that so obviously does not love God or follow the laws of God, and in fact violates them worst of all? And then probably adding to their frustration, once they're grumbling and asking, Jesus does not answer the question. Luke says, he tells them this parable about this man who had two sons, and one of them asked for the money, and as soon as he got it, took off and then wasted it all. And then comes back, and the father welcomes him, but that upsets the other son, and he doesn't like it, and so there's a fight there as well, and the whole family seems to be in disarray. Now, many of us have heard this story over and over again. I think of it as the Prodigal Son. The subtitle my Bible gives it is the parable of the prodigal and his brother. But you know, as I read it over and over this week, as we're thinking about what we might talk about today, the character that stood out for me was the father. The force in the parable is the man, is the father. The compelling force is this tremendous love of the Father. This love that seems to encompass both sons, even when they don't seem to deserve it. It describes a love that is so rich, so bountiful, so extravagant that neither of the boys handle it well. Neither of them seem to know what to do with it. One of them takes this precious love of the Father, this generosity of the Father, and takes the money and runs and wastes it all. The other one, hearing the brother comes back, also receives the love of the Father, but he seems to want to restrict it. He wants to shut the brother out. He wants no part of that. The younger son is loose with it, and the older son is chintzy with it. Which son do you most identify with? Where do you find yourself in this story? Jesus seems to address both parts of the problem, seems to address both groups or both brothers, and his response in both of them, it seems to be so radical that they just don't know how to handle it. They can't handle it. They don't know what to do with it. It seems too magnanimous, too wild, if you will. It goes beyond our normal boundaries of how we treat people. It's just too far out. It's too wild. As I was thinking that this week, I remembered a song when I was coming of age in the 70s. Wild Thing. You remember that song? Boom, 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 boom. boom, 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 boom. Wild thing. Boom, 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 boom. You make my heart sing. Boom, 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 boom. Oh, you're everything. Boom, 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 boom. Wild thing. I think I love you. But I want to know for sure. Boom, 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 boom. I've been trying to get in the choir. I think maybe now I'm in. Maybe not. It's too wild. That song is all about young love and how compelling it is and how it draws us in. And yet, what comes with it is an uncertainty about how that love is going to work out. And that seems to be what's going on in this very story today. That this love is so wild, so beyond what we expect, that we're drawn to it, and yet we're not so sure how it all is going to work out. God's love must be the wildest thing around. I think that's what Jesus is saying. We're tweeting some things out during the week. That will be one of the tweets. God's love must be the wildest thing around because we can't handle it. We don't know what to do with such magnanimous and extravagant love. Oh, it feels pretty good when it's lavished on us, but what about those others that we judge to be inappropriate and unrespectable and unworthy? Well, Jesus says there was a man who had 2 sons. And one of them said, I want my inheritance now. Now, he would have been entitled to a third, but after his father had died. So he's basically saying, drop dead, Dad. I don't care about you. Show me the money. And to our great shock, the father says, okay. I'm thinking grab that kid by the collar and shake him and stop his world and say, are you kidding me? It's so disrespectful. But Jesus says, the father says, okay, and gives him his third. And sure enough, the son packs up and runs off and predictably goes through all of the money in no time. He's in dire straits, and then it gets worse because a severe famine hits, Jesus says, and he's got nothing. He's out of money. He has to go to work just when he thinks it can't get any worse. The guy he goes to work for sends him to feed the pigs. It would be an undesirable job probably for any of us, kind of dirty and messy, but for a Jew, it is the worst because it's breaking all their purity laws. And it means that you're going to be separated from your family. You're going to be separated from the synagogue. In fact, you're going to be outside of the covenant with God if you go and feed those pigs. And yet that's what he has to do. So at least he'll have something to eat because no one will give him anything, Jesus says. Have you ever found yourself feeling outside of God's love? It's a terrible place to feel like you've lost all relationship with friends and families and then even with God, that you've done so many things and been bad and gone down the wrong road and made so many poor decisions that you have gone too far. You're beyond the reach of even God's love. That's where Jesus says this young man is in the middle of this story. But then he says he came to himself and figured out that even though he's no longer worthy to be the father's son, that even the slaves and servants at least have something to eat, and he should go home, and he begins to rehearse his speech. I'm not worthy to be your son, but could I at least be a servant? And he begins to go home, Jesus tells us, and before he can ever reach the house, his father sees him from afar off, it says, and runs to him and embraces him and hugs him and kisses him. And the son begins to say, oh, I'm not worthy. And the father interrupts him and says, bring him a robe, the best one. Bring him the ring, which is probably the family ring, meaning he's part of the family. And bring him some shoes, bring him his sandals. And get that fatted calf We're going to kill it. We have reason to celebrate. My son who was dead is alive again. The one who was lost is found. And they begin to celebrate, Jesus says. And it's all wonderful until the elder son gets close to the house. He's been out in the field working diligently, and he hears the music before he gets there. And then when he gets closer, he sees there's dancing, and he's wondering, what in the world is going on? And he asks, and they say, oh, we're having a party for your brother. And you know, he's got to be thinking, are you kidding me? That bratty little disrespectful, irresponsible brother? And he gets so angry that he won't even go in. Word filters into the father, and interestingly enough, just as he went out to the younger son, Jesus says he goes out to the elder son and begins to plead with him to come in and be a part of the family. But the older brother's having none of it. He is so disgusted, he begins to give it to his father and tell him he's not doing this right. He's not treated him right. He's sure not treating this boy right who was so disrespectful. And what happens is he's just as disrespectful to the father as was the other boy. He can't handle it either. But Jesus says this father, on both accounts, has compassion. That's the word compassion, with passion, with feeling, with sensitivity. He seems to understand both of these boys, even though they're being disrespectful and they don't understand each other and apparently don't understand him. He seems to understand both of them. And even when they are ugly and disrespectful and unattractive, Jesus says the Father continues to love them. God continues to receive them even when they are at their worst and are the most unattractive. There's a story I read years ago that I think will help us understand this parable today. It's about Lieutenant John Blanchard and Miss Maynell. It's a story that comes from the early days of World War II. Lieutenant John Blanchard's in Florida. He has a few days before he has to be shipped out. He knows he's going to Europe to go to the heart of where the fight is. And he goes to the library and he finds a book that looks interesting, and he begins to read the book. And in the book, there are notes in the margin. And he thinks at first, beautiful handwriting, but then as he reads on page after page, he's finding that these notes are really helping him. He thinks whoever wrote this is really insightful. He begins to look to see if there's a name in the book, and sure enough, he finds the name Miss Hollis Maynell, New York City. And he decides he's going to write her a letter. And he begins to write the letter to tell her how much he appreciates what she's done. And as he's writing, he's thinking, you know what? Maybe she would correspond with me while I'm overseas. And so he invites her to do so. She writes back and says that she will correspond with him. So during the next 13 long months that he's in the middle of World War II, he's writing letters back and forth with Miss Maynell. And he begins to really appreciate who she is. And the more he reads her words, the more he begins to think maybe he has feelings for her. And he would kind of like to know what she looks like. So he asks for a picture. She says no. She says it shouldn't matter what I look like. We're friends, we're corresponding. If you want to be my friend, why would you need to know what I look like? So they continue to write back and forth. Finally, it comes to the end of his tour. He's going to come back, and he's going to be shipped to New York City. And he writes and tells her so and says, could I have the pleasure of taking you out to dinner? She says, sure. And they make the arrangement that she will wear a red rose on her lapel so he can spot her, and he will be carrying the book so she can spot him. And so it comes to that evening. He's in Grand Central Station, hundreds of people coming and going, passing by, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees a young, beautiful woman coming toward him. Striking features, bright blue eyes, long blonde hair, shapely. He thinks, oh, this is the one. He looks, she's looking at him. She's coming right at him. She says, going my way, sailor. And he's just ready to know this is the one. when he realizes no red rose on her lapel. And directly behind her is a woman twice his age, graying hair tucked up under a hat, hairpins, frumpy dress. The years haven't been kind. She's kind of pale and wrinkly, and she has a red rose on her lapel. He looks again at the woman that just went by. And then he looks back at Miss Maynell and holds up the book and steps toward her. She sees him and steps out. He salutes her and says, "I'm Lieutenant John Blanchard. You must be Miss Hollis Maynell. Could I have the pleasure of taking you to dinner?" But he's still thinking about the woman that walked by. When the older woman says, "Son, I do not know what this is all about, but that woman who just walked by asked me, begged me to wear this red rose. And she said, if you ask me to dinner, I should tell you she's across the street at that big restaurant waiting for you." Miss Maynell was a wise woman. She wanted to know what was in his heart, and when tempted, what he would do, how he would respond. Jesus says, if we want to know what the heart of God is like, it's like this. There was a man who had 2 sons. And even when they didn't deserve it, and even when they were unlovable and unattractive, he loved them anyway. He loved them in the midst of their acting out. He loved them in the face of their disrespect. He had compassion upon them. Bishop William Willimon, for years, was the dean of the chapel at our Duke University. Then he was elected bishop, served his term, is retired, and moved back to Duke. But he was our Barton Clinton lecturer years and years ago, and he told this story, and I've remembered it all this time. He said that one morning when he was still at Duke, he was walking across the campus with one of his colleagues, and his colleague said, "This is the difference between Jesus and me." And Willimon said, "What?" And he said, "Look at this." And there had been a party the night before, a big party on the campus. And there was trash everywhere, and beer cans and bottles and pizza boxes. And he says, "This is so disgusting. These students are so disrespectful of what they've received and the tradition and the fact that they share this campus with other people. And when I begin to see it, the anger just begins to build inside of me, and I just get boiling mad." But he said, when Jesus saw this kind of thing, he had compassion upon them. And Willimon said, "What?" And he said, "I see this kind of behavior and I just get angry. But Jesus saw us when we were unattractive and had compassion upon us." God's love is extravagant. It's radical. Sometimes it causes us to grumble. Our challenge is to receive and then share this radical love of God. It is a wild thing. It makes my heart sing. It's everything. I think I love you, but I want to know for sure. Amen.